Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the last time we did this was at the Delhi launch of Amrish's book. He's Amrish, I'm Ambarish, I'm sure you know that. I'm just the man with the extra syllable. The last time we did this was at an alfresco restaurant in Mehroli, which was quite charming, and we were sufficiently imbibed, lubricated with alcohol.
Speak for yourself, Amrish.
And there were cocktails gleaming on the horizon. So to do this again without alcohol, the prospect of that is a distinctly lowering one. But anyway, we are here to celebrate this book, Gods of Willow. It is what the Germans describe as a Bildungsroman, which is a coming-of-age novel. Strictly in biological terms, coming of age means attainment of puberty. But the young, urbane, very likable protagonist of this novel is not pubertal, he's post-pubertal. So it's the story of Kabir Menon as he negotiates the sophomore year of college, and student politics, and vanilla romance, and a great affinity for cricket, but a slightly average felicity for cricket, and inflamed communal passions. And then the first half of the book is situated in Hyderabad, and the action then moves to Mumbai, where he descends into the big, bad Gomorrah of mass communication and the 24 hours news cycle. And then, because it's a coming-of-age novel, there has to be the loss of innocence and naivety and the finding of redemption. So is that how you would summarize the book? And
Yeah, I think you probably did it better than I would. Bro, it is a story of growing up. It's a story of boyhood, when the training wheels come off, and then you're faced with the real decisions in an adult world that you've been aspiring to become an adult, and then the real repercussions of that. Set in, I think, India in the 90s, which is when I grew up, and I think it was a time when there was a lot of change, and I think not enough is spoken about the difference before then and after then, and I think at some point people will go back to it. It was a time when suddenly our thinking or our morality moved from a sort of pseudo-socialist thinking of the world to an acquisitive one. 90s is when the economy opened up, and we suddenly started seeing TV channels that were 24 hours, and you didn't have to wait for Doordarshan to come on with, the programs on animal husbandry before the cricket match would start, and that was a big deal. And I think a lot of our life, a lot of our growing up was fashioned by that change. Another part of that change was, that narrative continues, is the difference between us and them. And also, Kabir is going through, he's about 20 years old. It's the first time in his life he's beginning to realize that there is an us and them. Till that point, he's living in a community of, I chose Hyderabad because it's a mixed community of both Muslim and Hindu. And this is the first time, as I said, the training wheels come off. You start to realize that things are not a rosy glow as they were while you were growing up. So he's having to deal with all of these things. And then finally he moves to Bombay, and there is baptism of fire of essentially he's on his own. He needs to figure out and understand what career means, what ambition means, and the nature of it. So that's the story. And it's set in 3 years.
it's called Gods of Willow, and obviously it's a cricketing reference. And what's interesting is that throughout the novel, you'll get these passages which are about cricket. So every core element of dramatic structure in the book has a corresponding coordinate and an analog in cricketing action from our contemporary times. Why did you think of that device? What does cricket mean to you?
It's strange. It's one of the only things that I actually remember from childhood. Now, it's not my lessons. It's not things that I studied for, etc. And I think that's part of. Sometimes it's a part of a boy's growing up process. You get so attached to this bizarre game where you remember every. I still. Someone's asked me last night. I actually still remember a lot of the statistics. I know what happened in the game. I know how I felt at that time. Much more impactful than most other periods of my life, or important events like graduation, etc., which I don't even remember what happened. But cricket matches, I'll remember. I mean, you asked me what happened in that over and how I felt when Sachin got out and were we going to win, etc. So I used it as a device because Kabir is that guy. He attached, it's kind of like a tribalism. It's your first exposure to belonging to something, where something means something beyond yourself. And I got into cricket when I was 8 or 9 years old, and that's what it was. It meant much, much more than most other things. So I thought it was a useful reference, and plus it saved me doing any research because, as I said, I remember all of it. So I just snuck it in, and it was fun. It was a nice way to go through the...
But you used God's a Willow, so it's not just a hero for you. It's up there in the pantheon. Is that how you treated your...
Yeah, so the passage in the book is Kabir has been surrounded by gods all his life, as we were, both Hindu and the idea of Allah, etc. But his real gods were the gods of cricket. Vivian Richards from West Indies, or Kapil Dev, or whoever else. And he attached meanings of life to the characters of cricketers that he had grown up with. So that's hence the gods of Willow.
In ancient Greece, whenever there would be an athlete that would be sent to a competition and would win and would come back after winning, his victory, it would be a he, his victory would be seen as a sort of testimony to the quality of the citizenry of that community. And therefore, he was giving a rousing welcome. All the great magnates of the city would welcome him, and there would be a civic procession where he would ride on their shoulders. And not just that, they would break down the wall. It used to be Greek city-states, so they would break down the wall because they felt that any community or any city that produced such great athletes no longer needed to defend itself. And the athlete would eat it at public expense. Do you think that's changed? Do you think we treat our cricketing gods differently these days?
Well, I don't think we break our walls down anymore. How did that work out for them, by the way? No, but I think the idea of having heroes in communities is even more extreme today than it may not be cricket as much anymore, but the idea of celebrity now, or having a hero that means something to your community is as much, or if not more now than it used to be before, for the sheer advent of media around us. If you ask me specifically about cricket, it's confusing now. I think in those days, because we had less in terms of influences, we only really had cricket and Bollywood. Now we've got a lot of other things. We've got the world opened up, and we see what's going on everywhere. So it possibly doesn't mean the same things that it used to do. We used to read about cricket matches. I remember listening to the radio. Like, I don't think the next generation will ever understand what the radio was. I mean, it was bizarre. And that's, I think, the other thing about the book, and when it's set in the 90s, the change that we went through. I think it was just a confluence of so many things happening at the same time. It just made for an interesting backdrop.
So, because it's a work of prose fiction, I'm going to request Amrish to read a small passage. Sure. Perhaps your most audacious paragraph.
Put me on the spot, why don't you? All right, this is a dog-eared page, so I'm just going to read from it, and this is Ambrish's copy, so I'm assuming he thought this was okay. Chapter 6. The day's light was extinguished, but for the halo on the tops of trees. What an incredible few days there had been till this moment. Kabir had rarely considered the divine. He could picture Hindu gods standing on clouds, beatific smiles on their faces, radiance around their crowned heads, their many arms akimbo, looking down at him with light shooting out of their palms and rays touching the tops of his head. It reminded him of Sunday mornings as a child, when people would be transfixed to the broadcast of the Ramayana. An entire country would come to a standstill during that hour of state-sponsored mythology. As he lay back on the grass chuckling, he noted that he was quite stoned. Just a few days ago, he was sitting glued to the TV with Mustafa, watching Sachin play the finest innings of his life. All doubts and insecurities associated with the Indian team were extinguished as they roared like lions. Much like the mythological conquest of Lanka by Rama's pious army, the Indian team, led by local hero Azhar, defeated the loudmouth aggressive Australians. Simultaneously, he was beginning to perform well at econometrics, which was still at that point the bane of his academic existence. Spending a little time at the library, being tutored by his friend Aarti had transformed a beguiling subject into a series of patterns. Kabir's mind worked well with visualizations. His comprehension was transformed as Aarti helped him rethink the equations into graphs and rates of change. The college team won over the weekend, and Kabir scored a respectable 34. After the game, the Hyderabad Cricket Association had called a few players, including him, to a selection camp. He tried to be nonchalant, keep it to himself, but his feigned indifference lasted only as long as it took him to bump into the first person he knew. The KMS posse set out planning travel to and from trials. They were going to be there, naturally. Aarti was also very excited, which was nice, but he wasn't sure she even knew the rules. Most importantly, there was peace at home. His father had uncharacteristically calmed down and made no mention of Kabir's future, his prospects, his attitude. Perhaps it had something to do with the HCA's selections or the econometrics result, but whatever it was, Kabir was thankful. Nowadays, their time was spent talking about cricket and what was happening at college. But these were not the reasons for Kabir's spiritual awakening. Divine intervention struck him merely an hour ago. The boys were on the verge of campus at the far end of the main field. Here, the grounds gave way to a grove of tall trees, far enough from the regular paths for the group to look like they were up to no good. In the diminishing early evening orange glow, the wail of peacocks heralded the end of the day. On Fridays, college kids would gather here and plan the weekend. Serene had emptied out a cigarette and now was filling it with bits of weed mixed with tobacco. They sat with their backs to the path so that no one would see them smoke. Serene lit the joint, and just as he passed it, someone called out Mustafa's name. Mustafa slapped Serene's hand away, and this is when it happened. Kabir spun around and saw Sahiba for the first time. Sahiba and Priya walked up to them. They seemed to know Mustafa quite well. He had lived a few homes down from the Baigs for years. As Kabir stared, he felt a yearning which was wholly unfamiliar with. Her beauty had jammed his circuit board. Mustafa introduced the girls and they made small talk.
Wonderful. Now, without giving too much of the plot away, one of the central kind of conflicts in the book is that you get inside the right machine and you get to see the anatomy of the beginnings of a riot and the physiology of a rioter. And you realize that even at the lowest level of our political ecosystem, which is student body politics, it's so easy to inflame tribal hatred and activate communal consciousness based on identity. And I ask you this because you've clearly devoted a significant chunk of your book to this. Do you think, more than anything, politics in our country has coalesced around identity? Do you think it's a different place? Do you think, because we clearly grew up in very different times, and there was a kind of secular common sense to our republic. Is this your way of kind of abominating against the politics of our time?
Wow, ask me a simple question, Amrish, why don't you? No, I think it's an important part of the story. It's not my personal stand against anything, really. I think it's a part of the story. It's a part of the journey that my protagonist goes through. And as far as politics and identity is concerned, I think it's essential for politics and identity to be merged. It's the manipulation of vested interest that is what makes it unsavory, for want of a better term. But politics and identity must go together. I mean, you are essentially electing someone to forward your own interests as an identity. But what you're talking about is the separation of communities in our country. And I mean, I suppose the question to ask is, did we just have when we were growing up, as you said, did we just have a sort of grace period, but the simmerings were always there, or was it the latter, as you said? Is it made it worse? And I think there are going to be a lot of talks over the next 2-3 days devoted to this topic. Anyways, it's the topic of our times.
I'd like to throw this open to the audience if you're keen on asking Amrish a few questions. A couple of questions.
Show of hands, anybody? Questions? Sure. I think we can continue.
Yeah. So I'll allow you to mull on this, but I'll ask one final question. The other very interesting part of this book happens in a newsroom. It's almost like a fevered section of the book. And Amrish mentioned that we grew up in pre-liberalization India. This was pre-1991, which was a different country. And both of us have been inhabitants and subjects of both countries in that sense. And one of the great collaterals of the lowering of tariff barriers and conspicuous consumerism was also the emergence of the 24-hour news cycle and satellite television. And suddenly, and as you've seen, it's this propulsive thing which is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that you need to manufacture grievance and you need to manufacture hurt, and it's like a drug. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So you need to constantly stoke and irrigate the dopamine circuits in your brain. Is that a madness that you'd foreseen when you were growing up and you were experiencing this? And why did you decide to have that section in your book?
Yeah, I think that was an important part of growing up in India at that time, coming from not having much in terms of much to consume in the media, to having news channels, which used to be a positive aspiration. For many, many years, this was something that we would look up to, and the people who would be in the newscasters, etc., were considered the important spokespersons of our generation, to what it's become now. And I think the word abomination that you use is much closer to that today. And we've gone through the whole cycle. So I think it is an important part of the story of not just Kabir, but what we have been through in India. And then it also goes to the question that you had about polarizing communities, etc., and it plays an important part in that too. So yes, I think it's an important story to tell.
Any questions? Yes, I can see a hand there. Yes, indeed, the gentleman there.
So it's, am I audible? Yeah, so it's actually interesting you mentioned the news thing. I happen to work in the news media, and you mentioned that you've written it with the context of, from a time you had nothing to a time where you suddenly had a lot of options. And obviously, there's been more change, even I would say, that you went from having a lot of options to having even more options. Do you think that, you'd maybe be interested in writing, say, a sequel to this, keeping this sort of the modern thing in mind, like, modern times, let's say? Would that be something?
The sequel of this will be a TV screen with 16 boxes of people screaming at each other. I'm working on that.
You could write it, and it could very well be a Netflix adaptation. Who knows? That might be the sequel.
We'll exchange numbers after this.
Yeah, please. Would be very interesting. Thanks.
Ambrish revealed to me that this was written as a cinematic script. Have you received an offer?
Not yet, sadly. So anyone who wants to make this into a movie, please see me afterwards.
All right. We've completely run out of time. I thank you all for coming. I urge you to read this book. It's a fascinating read. Oh, there's a question. We'll allow the lady. Yes, please. Um,
So the way you described your book, I'll surely read your book. And earlier I didn't watch cricket, but from now on I'll start watching it. So my question is that why have you named your book Gods of Willow? Like what's the reason behind it?
Well, I don't know how much you know about cricket, but willow is the wood from which cricket bats are made. So it's just using that as a device. Nothing more intellectual than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you, sir.
and there's a young man in a school blazer, I reckon. We'll give him the last word.
You have 4 seconds, by the way. So either you get up and just scream your question.
My question is that do you personally think that you followed the quote-unquote traditional cliche coming of age basically method, or do you think that you've done something new?
Ooh, good question. I think a little bit of both. I think I've done something new because I've not heard of this story before, but I think it's also a fairly universal idea of the coming of age. So to that respect, I think there will be some commonalities with other things that may exist already.